This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace.
My Instagram account is full of images like this, and there are very deep shadows, and I'm making sure, and I've made a video about this in the past called Protect Your Highlights, that the brightest highlights in the image are exposed correctly and everything else can fall very dark. And a lot of my street photography is shot like this. One of the biggest questions I get asked about this sort of photography is, how are you exposing for that shot? What sort of metering are you using specifically? Are you using aperture priority, shutter priority, auto, ISO? Are you in full auto? Exposure compensation, where are you setting it? Are you using spot metering or evaluative metering? And the answer is, I take all of that stuff out of the equation and I only shoot in manual mode. Now let me say right up front, I don't think I'm better than anyone because I shoot in manual mode, and I'm not some kind of snob that says you should always shoot in manual mode or you're not a real photographer, because that's obviously rubbish. If you shoot aperture priority or whatever you choose to use as a mode and it works for you, absolutely carry on. But I want to share in this video about why I choose to shoot in manual mode, and why for the sort of photography, whether it's studio photography or portraits outdoors or street photography, for me shooting in manual mode, I actually find it easier and I find it faster to get the exposure that I actually want in camera. I still shoot aperture priority every now and again for events or when things are moving fast. It's definitely the way to go. But for 95% of the photography I do, I have the time to set the exposure exactly the way that I want to. And because I'm a little bit of a control freak, I want to take full control and not let the camera do any of the thinking for me. And it took me a while to get there. When I started out in photography, I lived in aperture priority. I just stuck the aperture as low as possible, because that's what you do when you get lenses that have a nice shallow depth of field, and I just shot everything aperture priority, and I thought that was the way to do things. And it was less an artistic decision, if I'm honest, on my part, and it was more because I was afraid of shooting manual, because I assumed it was so complicated I wouldn't be able to get a handle on it. So I'm going to demystify manual mode for those of you who might be a bit intimidated to go to manual, and that's why you're sticking to metering modes. It's really not that complicated, and there's only a few things to think about. And anyone who wants to go professional in the long run, it's a great thing to do to know how to take full control of your camera, balance the different elements to get exactly the exposure you want, because I think you'll work faster and you'll be more consistent in the shots that you get. So let's explain this. Okay, so let's start out with the basics. Every camera is basically two different elements, and the one is going to be your lens and the other is going to be your body. Obviously this is a camera split in half, sort of down the middle. So this is the basic layout of an old DSLR, but mirrorless, it's the same principle as well. We now have three different elements that we can change within our camera to change our exposure. The one is going to be ISO, the other is going to be shutter speed, and the last one is aperture. Okay, and within these three elements, this is how we can change the exposure using our manual mode. ISO relates to our sensor over here. This would have been film in the old days, and this could be made more or less sensitive to light coming into the camera. In the old days, you would choose a higher ASA number. Say if you wanted to shoot indoor events or something like a music gig at night, you'd choose 1600 film speed. If you were shooting in the bright sunlight, you'd choose 100. So this is usually denoted by some kind of number from 100 sort of through to 1600, obviously much higher now with modern cameras. So this is our ISO. In the middle here we've got our shutter speed. This is usually a mirror on a DSLR that flips up to reveal the sensor for an amount of time. And the amount of time it stays open obviously lets more light through to the sensor to be caught in the image. So that amount of time that it's left open to let light in is called shutter speed. Shutter speed is usually denoted by a fraction unless you're shooting long shutter speeds. So 1/4000 would be a fast shutter speed, right through to say half a second would be quite a slow shutter speed. That's the amount of time that's left open to let light through in to be caught on the sensor. And the last piece is our aperture. Aperture is denoted as the little ring inside the actual lens which opens and closes to let light in. That is determined. The bigger that hole is, this aperture obviously is open, it lets more light in through as the mirror opens and to be caught on the sensor. The smaller it's open, obviously it will let less light through. And aperture is usually denoted by an F number. So very, very wide open, like a really big aperture would be something like 1.4, and say f16 would be quite a small aperture. And these are the only three elements we have to learn about to be able to balance our exposure manually. Okay, so once you know the three elements that make up any exposure, you know the basics of your exposure triangle. And the three things are, again, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Okay, once you know these, it's just a case of balancing these out, these three elements, to get the correct exposure, the light in the correct place in your image. So let's say that we want to, our ISO is going to run, let's say from 100 to 6400. Okay, there's cameras obviously that go way past 6400. That's not the point. This is just for illustration's sake. So down this end, this would be a darker exposure, and at the top here, this would be a lighter exposure, bringing in more light. For our shutter speed, let's put our darker exposure down this end. Let's say 1/8000th of a second would be a very fast shutter speed that wouldn't bring in much light. And up at our bright end here, let's say we had something like 8 seconds, okay? Like a landscape photographer, leaving the shutter open for a long period of time brings in a lot of light they have to control, but also it'll slow the motion down, which will look great. Okay, and everything in between. And obviously there's stuff outside these ranges, every camera is different. For our aperture priority, let's say f22 right at the top here, so a very, very small aperture opening, wouldn't bring in much light. And on this end, let's say f1.4. That's quite a wide aperture opening. You can get lenses that go down to 0.95 and other things, but just for the sake of example. Now, to create any exposure, all I'm going to do is balance these three elements against each other. So if I want more light, I could bump my ISO up, I could slow my shutter speed down, or I could open up my aperture. Any of those three. If I'm looking at my exposure and saying it's too bright, I could darken it down by closing down my aperture, by speeding up my shutter speed, or by dropping my ISO down. Those are my three options. And all you need to know to make a good exposure is what the trade-offs are for each of these sides. So shutter speed's trade-off is movement, okay? And that just means that when you close down or speed up your shutter speed, what it's going to do is affect how movement appears. Up here, if you shot something with 8 seconds shutter speed, it's going to blur. But if you shoot it with 1/8000th of a second, it's going to freeze your motion, okay? So you need to know when you are playing with your shutter speed, the slower your shutter speed is going to blur motion, and the faster your shutter speed is going to freeze it. That's the trade-off for shutter speed. ISO, your trade-off is going to be noise. Okay, up here 6400 is going to give you a high amount of noise in your image. Down here it's going to give you a low amount of noise in your image at ISO 100. So if I introduce more ISO, I might be bringing more digital noise into my image. That is ISO's trade-off. Okay, an aperture priority, or your aperture, is going to introduce depth of field. Okay, depth of field speaks about how much of your image is actually going to be in focus. You might want a very shallow slice, a very shallow depth of field if you're shooting a portrait with just the front of the faces in focus and everything else is blurred, or a landscape photographer might want a very deep depth of field to keep everything in focus the whole way through the shot from foreground to background. So up here at f22, you're going to get a deeper depth of field than you would down at 1.4, which is going to give you a shallow depth of field. So when we are deciding, should I darken things down by closing down my aperture? I'm going to deepen my depth of field. Should I darken things down by speeding up my shutter speed? I'm going to freeze action. There's going to be less motion blur. Should I darken things down by lowering my ISO? That's great because there's going to be less noise in the image. If I want to brighten things up with my aperture, I'm going to shallow up my depth of field. I need to be aware of that. If I slow down my shutter speed to brighten things up, I need to be aware that movement is going to start to blur more. And if I open up my ISO to brighten things up, I need to be aware that I might be introducing more noise. And when you understand each of these three things are going to control your exposure and each have their trade-offs, once you know what those trade-offs are, you can start to make decisions because maybe you want to blur the movement, maybe you want to shallow your depth of field, and within all of this, you're also going to get exactly the correct exposure that you want to achieve. That might sound a little bit complicated, but actually it leaves you with only two questions to ask yourself for any exposure you make. Number one is, how do you want your depth of field to appear? And that will be shallow or deep. And that is going to obviously relate to your aperture. And number two is going to be, how do you want movement to appear? Do you want it to freeze? Or do you want movement to blur? And the reason I say, obviously this is shutter speed, and the reason I say there's only two questions is because the third question would be, how much noise do I want in my image? And the question, I mean, that's not a question. We always want as little noise as possible. So ISO should always be as low as possible. That's always where you want to think. So in terms of creative questions that you want to ask yourself, how do you want movement to appear? How deep or shallow do you want your depth of field to be? These are the two questions you're going to use, and they're going to inform how you balance those three elements to get the correct exposure. Okay, let's use a quick example just to drive this home. I've got my aperture, my shutter speed, and my ISO. And let's take two different photographers. Okay, the first is going to be a sports photographer, and the second is going to be a portrait photographer. And they are both shooting in manual mode. Okay, so your sports photographer is going to ask himself those two questions. What do I want my depth of field to be? What do I want my shutter speed to be? But shutter speed in his case is going to be way more important because motion is very important, and he wants to freeze the action. Say he's shooting a soccer game, football game, and there's lots of stuff moving around. He wants to freeze that action as it's happening. He's going to select something like 1/4000th of a second to freeze that action. Okay, then he's going to go, well, let's put my ISO as low as I possibly can. Say it's a daytime game, so he's going to be able to get away with ISO 100. And his aperture is going to be, say, you know, when he does everything and he checks his exposure, it's looking good at f4. Now, if he says to himself, f4 is actually too shallow a depth of field because he's shooting on a long lens and he needs to deepen that depth of field out, if he decides to go to f8, he's going to have to bump up his ISO to compensate, because closing this aperture down is going to let in less light, so he needs to make his ISO more sensitive to compensate for that, but he wants to keep that most important thing, which is his movement, frozen. Let's say a portrait photographer. They're in a studio. They know that he's shooting on an 85mm, say, and he wants f2.8 is going to be the depth of field that he wants. He knows that the most important thing is depth of field first. That's the most important question for this guy. So 2.8 on an 85mm is going to give him the depth of field that he wants. Now he's going to have to work out his exposure. So in a studio, let's say that he's on ISO 100 because he's got strobe light, so he can get his ISO down as low as possible, keep the noise out. But that's going to give him, for example, let's say 1/10 of a second shutter speed. Now, let's say that 1/10 of a second is introducing some shake in the camera. He's hand holding, the subject's moving around slightly, and it's introducing slight amount of blur, and the thing isn't as sharp as it should be. So now how does he get this to a better shutter speed that's going to freeze that action a little bit more and not give him a blurry image or with handshake? So let's say he takes it to 1/100th of a second. He needs to now bump his ISO up to compensate because he's given himself a faster shutter speed. He needs to increase his ISO to make it more sensitive to capture the light that's been lost by the fact that this shutter speed is firing faster. And his most important element here is his depth of field. That's where he starts. That's the question he's going to answer for himself. And any photographer if they are balancing these three elements with each other, starting with those two questions, what do I want my movement to look like, what do I want my depth of field to be, keep the ISO as low as possible, can answer any question and work out any equation what their settings should be. So that's the technical stuff, the exposure triangle and everything else. Let me show you how I actually shoot when I'm on the street. So there's a nice little slice of light over here with some dappled light coming in from the leaves and a little bit of an angle off the wall there. So if I'm looking at this, I know I want to expose for the brightest highlights in the sun. So I'm going to start with my ISO of the exposure triangle, because on a bright daylight today there's no reason to have any noise. So I'm going to set my ISO at 100. That's locked in. That's probably not going to change. And the reason I set that first is because that won't change. That's the thing that I'm going to change the least throughout the day. The next thing I'm going to look at, because I then have to ask those two questions, what's more important? Is it depth of field or is it movement? And for me on the street, movement is more important. I want to freeze movement. So I know from experimenting a bit that I need to be at 1/1000th of a second or faster. So that's the next thing I'm going to lock in, is 1/1000 in terms of my shutter speed. Now I've only got one thing to play with. So while I'm walking around, there's only really one element I'm playing with, and it's that third element of the exposure triangle, and that's my aperture. So as I'm looking at this highlight here, I'm going to expose it correctly so that there's nothing blown out on it, and looking at my aperture, I'm at f5. So now I know I can shoot this shot, I can shoot up here where there's like a building and there's bright light coming off the wall, down the alley over here, I can shoot over at the back here. I know no matter where I move, because the sun is hitting all these, the sun is a constant power at the moment, it's not changing drastically, that my exposure for my highlights is going to be correct no matter where I look. Just to show you how predictable it is when you're walking around on a bright sunny day, there's even a rule called the sunny 16 rule, which is just for days like this. And all that says is that if I set my f-stop, my aperture, at f16, then all I need to do is set my ISO and my shutter speed at corresponding numbers. So if I set my ISO at ISO 100, my shutter speed needs to be 1/100. If I set my ISO at 400, I need to set my shutter speed at 1/400. And if I do that on any sunny day, anywhere around the world, your bright highlights will be exposed correctly. Personally, I don't want to use the sunny 16 rule, because like I said, I want to freeze the action. I want 1/1000th of a second for my shutter speed, and I don't want ISO 1000. There's no reason to do that. In terms of getting the right exposure in the camera, there's a few different ways you can do it. Some people like to use the little meter at the bottom to tell you whether it's under or overexposed. But if you look at this scene now, because there's like a slice of light and there's a lot of shadow around it, my camera is going to probably tell me that I'm underexposed. And even if I'm using spot metering, I have to be very, very accurate with where I put that spot for it to tell me what I need to see. So I tend to use my histogram instead, and on my histogram I'm just making sure that there's no hard line on the right hand side of my histogram to make sure that I'm exposed correctly. And the nice thing about using a mirrorless camera is that I can actually live preview my exposure. It shows me what I've got on the screen or through the viewfinder. Because it's an electronic viewfinder, I can see exactly what exposure I'm getting, and I know the camera well enough to know when it looks right. So that's how I'm judging it. If you use a DSLR, the simple thing to do, and I used to do all the time, is literally just to take a test shot and then see where exposure is, dial maybe, you know, a couple of stops down, half a stop down, whatever, and take the shot again. Are you in the right place? And then you know you're good to go. So as you're walking around, you're taking that shot, exposing for your highlights, and you know once you're locked in, you're good for highlights. But if you walk down an alleyway, say, and the light's changed, or a cloud comes over and you need to adjust, or someone walks through the spot with a black shirt and then a white shirt, you need to adjust for those reasons, you're going to get to the stage, if you use your settings correctly on your camera and you know how to dial your settings in manually, that it's almost automatic. It's just little clicks and twists. So on the camera I've got set up, This is my shutter speed dial on the front. I've got my aperture dial on my thumb on the back, which is what I'm using the most for street photography, and then my ISO dial here. And I often find that when I'm walking around, I can walk around a corner, see it's a little bit darker, my thumb has already just clicked third of a stop, 2/3 of a stop, just to brighten things up before I've even thought about it. And because I'm using it all the time like that, I'm getting to know exactly what I want the camera to do and doing it almost automatically. So because I know my ISO is going to be locked off, I don't want noise, and my shutter speed is going to stay the same because I want to freeze motion, my aperture is going to be what changes, and aperture, as we said, affects depth of field. So I always need to keep it in mind when I'm changing that there is going to be an effect when I change my aperture. And I've got a little app that really helps with that. So the app's called DOF, stands for depth of field, and it's going to help you calculate what your depth of field is going to be, because depth of field is just an equation between your sensor size and your focal length, your aperture, and your distance to subject. So we can lock all those in. So I've already set what my camera is in the app. Then I'm going to set that I'm on 35mm, because that's the lens I'm using for the street photography I'm doing today. I know that my aperture is f5, because that's what I set it as. So now I can see that if I'm shooting someone at 4 meters, then I know that everything from sort of 2.75 meters right the way through is going to be in focus. If I shoot someone at 2 meters, I can see that actually I need to be a lot more careful, because now just before 2 meters, I'm already out of focus, and beyond 2.5, I'm out. So I can see that while I'm changing my aperture, this is how it's affecting my depth of field with this focal length on this sensor. So I can be flicking away, changing to get the correct exposure, but I just need to be aware that then the closer my subject is to me, then I need to be more aware whether in focus or out focus. If I was to bump this up to something like f8, for example, you can see that then I've got a lot more latitude. If I'm shooting someone at 2 meters now, I'm way after 3 meters, I'm still in focus. If they're at 3 meters, I'm already got tons of room to shoot. So I just need to be aware that as I change aperture, it's going to change my depth of field. So there's nothing wrong with shooting aperture priority or shutter priority or auto ISO or full auto or any of those automatic modes. If it works for you, carry on doing it. But the reason I don't is because I want to know exactly what my camera's doing, and sometimes I don't trust the metering in cameras. You've got a few options with your metering. You can evaluative metering, which is taking the exposure at the average of the whole frame, which isn't going to be useful if you're trying to get just a slice of light exposed correctly. You could center weight, but you'll have the same problem. Or you could spot meter, which is taking that very, very center point, putting it exactly on what you want to expose for and pressing so that it exposes, recomposing and taking the shot. But the problem with that is you have to be so accurate about where that point is hitting to make sure you get the correct exposure. And if you're trying to grab that every time, it's really difficult. You could get it right once and then exposure lock so that it locks it in your camera, but because you're doing an automatic mode or using an automatic mode, you don't actually know what your other elements are doing. If you're an aperture priority and you're at f4, you don't know what your shutter speed's doing every time because you're letting the camera decide. You don't know what your ISO is doing because you're letting your camera decide. I see a lot of people shooting these automatic modes and using exposure comp dials to bump it up or down, but the problem is you're not paying attention necessarily to what those other settings are. And if you are, just shoot in manual mode because you'll be there in 2 seconds. You know what your ISO is, you know what your shutter speed is, what its trade-offs are, you know what your aperture is and what its trade-offs are. And personally, as a control freak, I just like knowing what everything's doing and get no surprises when I get back and look at the shot later. So I hope this gives you some courage to go out there and more often to put your camera in manual mode and take back control. The other part of this is I genuinely enjoy shooting in manual mode more than any other mode. And I think about it for myself like driving a car. Personally, I don't think I will ever buy an automatic car. And the reason for that is, me personally, I like to change gears. I like clutch control. I like being a more mechanical part of getting to where I'm going in the experience of driving. I find it fun. And yes, when I started off driving, I had to think about changing gears a lot and, you know, clutch control and what gear was I in and what did I need to go to with what was coming up ahead of me. But somewhere very, very early on, I stopped thinking about the actual process of doing that and just got on with the experience of driving. And now I change gears and I haven't even realized I've done it. So that's my challenge to you. If you don't already, try shooting more in manual mode. You decide what your aperture is, what your shutter speed is, what your ISO is, and if you work at it, I promise you'll be comfortable with changing your own settings in no time at all. I'm pretty sure it will expand the possibilities for your photography as well, because in every image, you're going to be making decisions about how deep or shallow you want your depth of field to be. You're going to be working out exactly what you want movement to look like in your shots. You're going to be nailing your exposures, so you're going to define a style much quicker by making these individual decisions. Not to mention, you're going to feel much more confident as a photographer, and if you're like me, you're going to enjoy the process more as well. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they really are a fantastic option, especially if you're a creative. A friend of mine is starting a new yoga practice, and he got hold of me to take some images for it, which we did, and he took them away and then built himself a website on Squarespace. And I loved seeing my images in a good piece of design. And I asked him about the experience of putting the website together, and he said it was so simple, just choosing the right template, loading up the images, putting in the text. In no time at all, he had something that he's really proud to show potential new customers.
Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.